It was supposed to be a dream vacation, the kind of trip you imagine when the drudgery of daily life gets too heavy. My family and I were aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas, cruising through the Caribbean, the sun kissing our skin and the ocean stretching endlessly into the horizon. I'd taken some convincing to come along. Work was piling up back home, and the thought of being trapped on a floating hotel wasn't exactly my idea of paradise. But my sister, Amy Lynn, had insisted. "You need this, Mark," she'd said, her green eyes sparkling with that mischievous glint she always had when she knew she was right. Amy was like that, vibrant, impulsive, the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. And truth be told, I couldn't say no to her. Now, I'd give anything to go back and change it all. The night Amy disappeared is seared into my memory like a scar. I keep replaying it, searching for something I missed, some clue that might have explained what happened. But the answers are as elusive as the woman she became that night. A phantom, a whisper on the wind, gone before I could grasp her. It was late, past midnight, maybe closer to 2 in the morning. The ship's nightlife had mostly wound down, save for a few stragglers lingering in the casino. I'd had one too many cocktails and was heading back to our cabin when I passed by Amy on the upper deck. She was leaning on the railing, the wind catching her dark hair and pulling it back from her face. She looked peaceful, almost serene, staring out at the moonlit waves. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, stopping beside her. She glanced at me, her smile faint but genuine. "Just needed some air. Go to bed, Mark. I'll be right behind you." I hesitated. Something about her tone felt off, but I chalked it up to exhaustion and the weight of whatever thoughts she was chasing. "Don't stay out too long," I said, and she nodded. That was the last time I saw her. When I woke up the next morning, our cabin was eerily quiet. Dad was pacing, his face tight with worry. "She's not here," he said, voice low and tense. "Her bed hasn't been touched." The panic hit like a gut punch. Amy wasn't the type to wander off without telling someone. We combed the ship, calling her name, checking every corner. By midday, the crew was involved, their voices crackling over walkie-talkies as they coordinated the search. But the ship was massive, and the ocean beyond was even more so. She couldn't have just vanished, I kept saying, my voice rising with each repetition. People don't disappear like this. But they do, and she had. The captain assured us they were doing everything they could. They searched every cabin, every lifeboat, even the engine room. Nothing. They reviewed security footage, but the cameras on the deck where I'd last seen Amy were malfunctioning. Of course they were. By the time we docked, the authorities were involved. They questioned us, the crew, even other passengers. Some suggested she might have fallen overboard, but I knew my sister. Amy wasn't reckless, and the railing was high. She wouldn't have climbed it, not in the dead of night. The theories started swirling almost immediately. Maybe she'd been abducted, taken by someone who saw her as an easy target on a ship full of strangers. Maybe she'd staged her own disappearance, though that idea was laughable to anyone who knew her. Amy loved her life. She wouldn't just walk away from it. But then there were the sightings. The first one came a year after she vanished. A bartender in Curaçao claimed he'd seen her. He described a woman with green eyes and a tattoo of a Tasmanian devil on her shoulder, the same one Amy had gotten on a whim during spring break her senior year. He said she'd looked terrified, constantly glancing over her shoulder. Before he could approach her, 2 men had appeared, flanking her on either side. They led her out of the bar, and she didn't resist. Another sighting came a year later in Barbados. This time, a Canadian tourist swore she'd seen Amy at a beachside market. The woman had been trying to sell cheap trinkets, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. When the tourist mentioned Amy's name, the woman had turned pale and fled. Each new report was like a knife twisting in my gut. I wanted to believe she was alive, that she was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. But with every lead that went cold, hope became harder to hold on to. I started digging into the darker corners of the world, the places people don't talk about in polite company. Human trafficking, modern slavery, black market auctions where people are sold like cattle. The more I learned, the more I hated myself for not seeing the danger sooner. What if she'd been targeted? Amy was beautiful, outgoing, and trusting to a fault. She wouldn't have seen the danger coming. I hired private investigators, combed through reports, even traveled to the Caribbean myself, retracing her steps. Each time I came back empty-handed. It's been over 25 years now, 25 years of birthdays without her, holidays where her absence was a gaping wound. My parents have grown old, their hair gray and their eyes tired, but they still keep her photo on the mantel, still light a candle for her every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. As for me, I've stopped looking, not because I've given up, but because the search has consumed too much of me already. I live with the ghosts of that night, the whispers of what might have been, and every so often I dream of her, standing on that deck, the wind in her hair, her eyes filled with a secret I'll never understand. They say the ocean doesn't give up its secrets. I used to think that was just a saying. Now I know it's the truth. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of heat that crawled into your lungs and refused to let go. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, a mirror of steel gray under the blistering sun. I was standing on the deck of the Silver Star, squinting at the horizon through a pair of salt-streaked binoculars. That's when I saw it. The Orang Medan, a ghostly silhouette against the shimmering waves, her hull blackened and battered. She was drifting, aimless, her once proud masts sagging like the weary arms of a dying man. We'd picked up her distress call hours earlier. All officers, including captain, dead. Probably whole crew dead. The operator's voice on the radio was fragmented, garbled with static, but unmistakably filled with terror. Then, after a long, static-filled pause, came the final words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I die. I was part of the boarding team, one of the first men to step foot on that cursed ship. As our small motorboat approached her hull, I noticed how unnaturally still she seemed, as though the air around her had been sucked into a vacuum. Even the sea felt different here, choppier, angrier, the metallic tang of salt mixed with something else, something acrid and sickly sweet that made the back of my throat burn. "Stay sharp," I muttered to the others, as we prepared to climb the rope ladder dangling from the Orang Medan's side. My boots hit the deck with a hollow thud, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The ship was silent, oppressively so. No creaking of wood, no hum of machinery, not even the screech of gulls that usually followed vessels like this. It was as if the Orang Medan had been abandoned by life itself. But she wasn't empty. We found the first body sprawled near the bow, face twisted into an expression I'll never forget. His mouth was open in a soundless scream, eyes wide and bulging, as though he'd glimpsed something so horrific that death was a mercy. He clutched at his chest, fingers locked in a claw-like grip that left deep gouges in his uniform. But there were no wounds, no blood, just terror. "Jesus Christ," one of the men whispered, crossing himself. The second body was near the chart room, a young man, barely out of his teens, slumped against the wall. His eyes were frozen wide open, staring at something we couldn't see. I stepped closer, my boot brushing against something on the floor. A piece of paper. It was part of a map, smeared with what looked like blackened fingerprints. Burn marks. I stuffed it into my pocket, though I had no idea why. Maybe a part of me wanted proof, something tangible to explain what I was seeing. The rest of the crew lay scattered across the ship, each death more grotesque than the last. The engine room was the worst. The heat down there was unbearable, like stepping into the mouth of a furnace. The bodies were contorted, twisted into impossible angles, their faces locked in that same expression of pure, unfiltered fear. Whatever had killed them had done so without leaving a mark. The ship's dog was near the galley, its lips peeled back in a snarl, teeth bared as though it had been frozen mid-growl. Its eyes, like the others, seemed to follow me as I moved past. I didn't speak. None of us did. There was a weight in the air that made words feel irrelevant, like whatever had happened here was beyond language. But the longer we stayed aboard, the heavier that weight became. It was like the ship itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. In the radio room, we found the operator still seated at his station, one hand clutching the transmitter. The air reeked of ozone and something chemical, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I leaned in to inspect the equipment, only to notice something carved into the desk's surface. 4 words, scratched deep into the wood. They come from below. A chill crawled up my spine, despite the stifling heat. Below. I glanced toward the hatch that led to the cargo hold, a dark, yawning mouth at the center of the deck. No one had dared to go down there yet, and I wasn't about to volunteer. The captain's body was the last we found. He was slumped over his charts, his hand still clutching a compass. His face was the worst of all, his mouth stretched impossibly wide, as though he'd died mid-scream. Beside him lay a leather-bound logbook, pages warped from the heat. I flipped through it, skimming entries that grew increasingly erratic in tone. The last page was stained, but I could just make out the words, "We shouldn't have opened it. God forgive us." Opened what? Before I could ponder the question, one of the crew called out. Smoke, black and acrid. It was seeping from the lower decks. "She's burning!" someone shouted. We scrambled back to the ladder, but the heat was rising faster than we could move. Flames licked up the sides of the hull, and the deck groaned beneath our feet. By the time we made it back to the motorboat, the Orang Medan was an inferno. We rowed away as fast as we could, watching in stunned silence as the ship exploded with a deafening roar, a plume of fire and smoke shooting skyward. When it was over, there was nothing left, just the endless sea and the echo of those final words, "I die." I've spent years trying to forget what I saw that day, trying to rationalize it, but every so often I wake in a cold sweat, the phantom scent of that sickly sweet odor in my nose, or the echo of whispers I didn't hear until after we'd left. They come from below. I don't know what was on that ship, but I know this. Some things are better left buried. I remember the night before it happened. Clear skies, the cool Mediterranean breeze brushing against my face as I stood on the deck of the Costa Concordia. The ship was everything you'd expect from a luxury liner, gleaming white, towering over the water like a modern-day giant, and filled with passengers excited for what promised to be an unforgettable cruise. I had boarded in Civitavecchia, just another traveler looking for a little escape, a little peace. It was to be my first time in the Mediterranean, and everything about the trip felt right. But I had no idea how quickly that sense of safety, that feeling of invulnerability, would shatter. January 13th, 2012. The day everything changed. The night started like any other, passengers mingling over drinks, laughter spilling from the bars and lounges. There was a low hum of contentment in the air. People telling stories, making memories. I stood near the railing, looking out at the blackness of the sea, the only thing visible being the faint glow of distant lights along the coast. The ship was cutting through the water like a knife, the engine's steady rumble vibrating beneath my feet. But something was off. There was a strange, unsettling energy in the air that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was nothing more than an overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It was around 9:40 p.m. when the first shock wave hit. A terrible jolt, followed by a deafening noise. The deck beneath me trembled violently, and I stumbled, barely able to keep my balance. The screech of metal on rock echoed through the ship as the Costa Concordia slammed into something unforgiving. My heart leaped into my throat. For a moment, everything was still. I had no idea what had happened, but then the alarms went off. The shrill, bone-rattling sound of a ship's emergency warning system sent my adrenaline into overdrive. Panic spread like wildfire. People surged toward the stairwells and elevators, trying to figure out what had just occurred. The walls seemed to groan, and I could feel the ship shift beneath me, tilting just slightly. The water beneath us, something about it felt different. I glanced around, but no one seemed to have any answers. The ship was still moving, but there was a faint, undeniable list to it. Then the ship tilted more, much more. The lights flickered and went out for a second. The chaos that ensued was impossible to describe. People screamed, children cried, and the panic grew by the second. I pushed through the crowd, my thoughts racing. What was happening? Was this a fire? A mechanical failure? I didn't know, but I didn't want to wait around to find out. My instincts told me to get to the lifeboats, to get off the ship as fast as I could. The idea of being trapped on this colossal hunk of metal, shuddering, sinking, was unbearable. I rushed toward the nearest exit, but that's when I saw the ship's list grow even worse. The floor tilted at an impossible angle. Tables and chairs from the dining area crashed against the walls, glasses shattered in a cacophony of breaking glass. I fought against the surge of passengers, the desperation in their eyes matching my own. The ship was sinking, and we were all going down with it. I reached the stairwell, but the scene there was a nightmare in itself. Passengers were fighting to get to the lifeboats, and the crew, God bless them, were trying desperately to maintain order. But no one knew what to do. The situation was slipping out of control faster than anyone could react. Some passengers were already in the lifeboats, but the majority of us, myself included, were still stuck, unsure whether to board or not, or worse, unable to reach one at all. I had to make a decision. I could hear the creaking of the ship as it shifted, groaning with each passing second. Time was running out. I dashed for the lifeboats, but the decks were nearly impossible to walk on. People were sliding down the now near vertical surfaces, trying to hold on to anything to keep from falling into the icy sea below. I saw people clawing at the railings, terrified of what lay beneath. Then it hit me. The ship wasn't just listing, it was sinking. I reached the lifeboat station, but the scene there was worse than I could have imagined. The boats were being lowered, but they were far from full. Panic had made people irrational. Some had jumped in, but there were still too many passengers fighting to board, and no one was in charge. The lifeboats were being lowered, but there were only so many, and with the deck tilting more every minute, people began to scream and claw at each other, desperate for a way out. I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned and ran. That's when I saw her, the woman I had been standing next to earlier in the bar. I don't know why, but I remembered her face. She was standing at the railing, looking out over the dark water, her hands shaking as she held on. "Help!" she cried. She was trapped on the wrong side of the ship. My heart skipped. I knew I had to help. There was no way I could leave her behind, even though the ship was slowly but surely tipping into the depths. I ran toward her, pushing through the throng of people, slipping on the floor, hearing their screams echoing in my ears. I reached her just in time to see her desperately reaching for the last remaining lifeboat, but the deck was too steep, and she couldn't reach it. "Come on!" I shouted, pulling her by the arm, dragging her toward a lifeboat on the other side. But then I saw it, the lifeboat being lowered, and it was almost full. The crew was shouting at people to stay back, to let others board. My heart dropped. I couldn't leave her alone in this mess. But that was when the ship groaned, louder this time, and the lights flickered once again, this time for good. The entire ship shuddered as the waters rose beneath us. The reality hit me like a freight train. The Costa Concordia was sinking. I don't know how long we waited, but it felt like hours. The cold water was rising, creeping up my ankles, then my knees. I could see the water seeping into the ship, sloshing with each new wave. The lifeboats had long since gone. My thoughts were scattered, and I felt the overwhelming pull of fear, knowing we were now trapped in the dark belly of a sinking ship. But then, finally, a rescue boat appeared in the distance. We were saved, or so I thought. It wasn't until much later, as we huddled together on the rocky shores of Giglio Island, that I learned what had happened to her, the woman I had tried to save. She was gone, and that was when I realized the true horror of the disaster. The Costa Concordia, despite the most advanced technology, had not just been destroyed by the sea. It had been destroyed by human error, by arrogance, and by a single reckless decision to sail too close to an island. As I stood there, watching the once proud ship finally come to rest on its side, I couldn't help but think that it could have been me, could have been any of us, lost forever in the waters of the Mediterranean. But I was one of the lucky ones. 32 souls, however, weren't. And for them, the story of the Costa Concordia will never fade.